So, who are these guys and what did they do? They were the first organized unit that the U.S. Army or basically anybody else ever did that was full multimedia, full spectrum. So any kind of way that you would look at, are these real troops or not, they had that covered really very well. And there are pieces of some of their work that are, well, they're briefed to current soldiers that are involved in deception. The National Security, or not, the National Ground Intelligence Center people get some of this stuff because nobody did it like this. And not many people have done it since either. So they had 4 ways of doing deception and they worked them together. So you saw the rubber tanks and the rubber trucks. Well, that's one aspect of visual. Sonic is broadcasting the proper sounds of things happening. So if you just see rubber things, but they're dead quiet, tanks make noise, troops make noise, and then they had radio, which I'll talk about in a little more detail, and also special effects, also more detail. So, next please. Here's some of the visual deception stuff. The design for all of the rubber dummies was done at Fort Belvoir, what is today North Post. And in fact, the photograph on the lower left-hand corner of the tank, that's in one of the buildings that was there. It's no longer there, not too far from where the PX is. But at a bit of a distance, those look pretty good. And the visual deception was so good in some cases, and this is one of my favorites. That's an L5 spotter plane, done all in balloons. Now, of course, you can't just put out an airplane, right? You have to have an airstrip for the airplane. So they would have to create an airstrip to put the rubber balloons, the rubber airplanes next to. And of course, the airstrip had to be a viable airstrip. So the thinking that has to go all together with this, you can't have just a junky piece of ground that nobody in their right mind would land an airplane on. So it has to go together. The flip side of that is, because this is so secret, other pilots don't know. And so they would have real planes landing on their airstrip and taxiing up next to the decoy planes, and the troops would have to run up and go, shh, get out, get out, get out. But what they did is they would camouflage these. Some would be camouflaged quite well, and some would be camouflaged, it was a bad day for those soldiers camouflaging that piece of equipment, so something would stick out. So it would have the right contour, and a little something exposed, just enough, so that somebody getting a bit of a look, and they had security around so they couldn't get too close, would see it and go, well, they have M8 Greyhounds, upper right-hand corner. Or they have deuce and a halves piled up or lined up in their upper left-hand corner. So it's not just having the particular item, but it's knowing how to emplace it. Next, please. The earlier versions of the tanks were not super realistic, but they started working on them and they painted a lot of stuff on them. So again, the artists are right there, they're stenciling things in the field, and they get better and better as time goes on. Yeah. This is from Operation Viersen, which I will talk about in a little bit in more detail, but take a look. Anything stand out? Pardon me?
The tracks.
The tracks, yeah. You can't have vehicles driving through a muddy field and not leave tracks. And the tracks have to match the vehicle. In other words, if the vehicle is parked at a particular point, the tracks have to lead and then stop there. You can't just randomly put the tracks in. So what you're seeing here, pretty much everything in here except the buildings is a dummy. That's all deception stuff. That's all the visual piece of it. And this was a pretty important one because this is the setup for the crossing of the Rhine. So it had to be good. Now, sonic deception. Again, you have to have the right sounds to go with it. And this is state-of-the-art stuff in 1944. Nobody would build a more powerful amplifier until 1961 for the Beatles concert at Shea Stadium. Each of those speaker cells in here, each of these little squares, is one speaker of the type that they put on aircraft carriers to give orders on the deck of an aircraft carrier with all the planes taxiing and whatnot. They would put out an enormous amount of sound. They were made by the Bose Speaker Company. This is also one of the things about this is they're working very, very closely with industry. But industry is not driving them. It's the Ghost Army people coming up with the ideas, what they need, the capability, and telling industry, go make it work. For those who you've probably all seen it, if you think about it, the acoustic chambers or broadcasting studios that have all the foam on the wall. First one of those was created by a guy named Leo Baranek at MIT, young physicist, and they said, we need to be able to absolutely identify sound with no interference, no echo, no nothing. And he created the first anechoic chamber, which is now standard in broadcasting studios, but that was the first one, and it was done so that they could calibrate this stuff. So they could adjust the sound to the distances, the humidity, the type of terrain, so that somebody hearing it on the other side isn't hearing an obvious recording. What they're hearing, or they think they're hearing psychologically, is whatever you're broadcasting. This is also some of the first multiplexing. So they would create different tracks and they would multiplex them onto a wire recorder. They had spools of hair-thin wire in cassettes, and it ran about 30 minutes a cassette. And they also had figured out how to break the Doppler effect. If you all stood somewhere and you've heard a car coming up and it makes one sound when it comes up towards you and it makes a different sound going away, that's the Doppler effect as it compresses sound waves. They figured out how to record things without the Doppler effect. So a lot of very technologically smart stuff going on and factored in. Radio deception. If you're going to have somebody, they're going to be imitating two full divisions at a time as their maximum capability. That's over 30,000 soldiers with all their equipment. And they have big radio nets. They're blasting radio signals all over trying to coordinate that. Well, they had a complete set of divisional radios. Every size and power strength of a radio, they had it. The other thing they had was they had encryption machines. They were one of the only field units in the Army that was in Europe that had what's called a Sagaba machine. Primarily the Navy used them. The Army had only a very few of them, but because these were simulating very high-level traffic at the division and Army level, they had one to produce the kind of sound that the German listening stations would pick up and say, aha, it's their coding machine. They still were running junk through it, but it was sending the right signature for a listening station. And then special effects. This evolved. Originally, they weren't doing special effects. The soldiers themselves came up with most of this. And in this case, you're seeing them repainting bumper markings. The Germans left behind stay-behind agents who would collect information by looking at the bumper markings on our vehicles. And so these guys would change the markings. Right now, this is being done up as a military police jeep for the 90th Infantry Division. Next week, it might be the 79th or the 30th Infantry Division. And they would also have the appropriate uniforms to go with it. If they were an armored division, there would be guys with tanker jackets, which are different from what infantrymen wore. And on top of that, they produced their own patches. So some of you have probably seen at some point the old movies where the guys are told to tear off their patches. Well, the reason for that was the Ghost Army was going to put other patches on to pretend they were them. And so one division blacks out to go somewhere when the Ghost Army comes in wearing their stuff, and that's part of that visual deception package. They also would do things like feigning drunkenness. So a couple of guys would pretend to be drunk. They'd walk into a bar already half lit, and they'd say something they shouldn't. All practiced. They got approval to impersonate officers. And so they had captains, Captain Reb, for example, became a colonel. 18 months out of West Point, he's a full colonel. And he said it was really funny because people would come into his fake command post, which looked real. You make a command post, among other things, by running a lot of wire out of it, because it has a lot of communications coming in and out. And he said nobody ever asked him directly, but men that were senior to him, that had graduated from West Point ahead of him, are coming in. And he's already a full colonel. He's, I think, about 25 at that point. But they always went to his first sergeant and said, how did he make, hey, it's the Army, right place, right time. And they'd go muttering out the door. He had great fun with that. Captain Reb at that time ended up being Major General Reb. So he was able to pull it off, and I guess did for the rest of his career. Overall, the Ghost Army created, they had what was called a factory section. They created over 40,000 shoulder patches of different divisions so that they could mix and match. And the guys got very good at sewing them on and taking them off. But as one guy griped, he said, it wrecked your shirts. You can only sew something on there so many times. Okay. They did 21 major deception operations in the European theater that we know about. This is something we're still working on. They also did some smaller ones, and they did some behind-the-lines stuff that is, in some cases, it's mentioned in the official history, but in obtuse ways. So, example, a couple of soldiers on a lark went across behind German lines into Paris before Paris was liberated. Oh, they had a wonderful time, ha. That's in the official history. Luckily, that official history was kept top secret for years. The Army doesn't like soldiers doing that without orders. And they really don't like it if they've been working in all this very secret stuff, going out and going into occupied territory. But they did. So now the question is, so what were they doing? What clearly they were doing is they hooked up with the French underground and the Maquisards in Paris. But that's still an open question. What is the Ghost Army doing with the French underground that's different from the rest of the Army, and why do they have a couple of their guys in there? The guys went back, they were never disciplined. They never even got a stern talking to, and it made it in the official history, so that suggests that it was probably okay. But look at where they were. Normandy. The first Ghost Army soldiers arrived on Omaha and Utah Beach, D-Day, H-hour +6. All four of them were they were all four wounded that day from shrapnel coming down from anti-aircraft fire from our own ships. So not always the greatest thing to do. They were instrumental in the breakout across France and Operation Cobra. They were there at the Battle of the Bulge, and the Germans got within about 400 yards of their command post during the Bulge, and they were ordered out because they had all this, again, very secret stuff, and it was either going to be blown up in place or get it out, and so they got it out. And then the crossing of the Rhine, which was one of their really big things. So a lot of that going on. If you can imagine, from June of 1944 to May of 1945, the average vehicle clocked 22,000 miles. That's everywhere. Okay. That's the operation map. I put that in because you can't see it, so it needed to be bigger. Sorry. Part of the fun of that, my dad drew that. He was directed by the commander to put a map together of all their operations, and that's how he put it all together on one sheet. Now, it's a big sheet. It's about that wide by about that tall. But it clocks all of their operations and where they went in phases, and also includes, if you look at it in more detail, some of their other operations other than deception. Next, please. Let me talk about, I'm only going to talk about two specific operations because I want to spend some time talking about the soldiers themselves. And given where we are, I want to focus on more particularly the Jewish soldiers that were part of the units. But this is Operation Bettembourg. This is where the real units are in the south end of this map. This, by the way, is one of the real maps. And this is Patton investing the city of Metz. Metz is one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe at that point. And he's trying to take it. And it's not going well. And what has happened is he's drawing troops down here. 21st Army Group under Montgomery is pulling troops up here. It creates a gap about 70 miles wide. And all that's there is one cavalry squadron. They have no heavy tanks, they only have light tanks, and they have those armored car kind of things. So as Paris is being liberated and the Ghost Army guys are enjoying being part of the liberation, and isn't this great and wonderful, they're told pack up and drive 250 miles fast as you can and create out of almost thin air a deception to pretend that you are the 6th Armored Division minus a task force when the 6th Armored Division is back in Lorient, which is out there on the Atlantic coast of France. At that point, there is nothing between the Germans and Paris except one cavalry squadron and the Ghost Army covering that 70-mile gap. Patton made some references to it in letters to his wife. You know, we're taking some huge risks here. We're pretty thin. And normally they figured that you really shouldn't operate one of these for more than about 2 to 3 days. Eventually something's going to give you away. This had to go on for close to 10 days. And each day it's getting worse and worse and worse for the guys because, you know, imagine you're trying to pretend you're a tank mechanic. You're trying to pretend you're working on the tank if somebody comes by and sees it. You've got to do that for a week. It gets kind of boring. And the other thing, again, is all you've got is your own weapons that you've got with you, and it's not a lot of them. They don't have artillery as part of the unit. Biggest thing they have as part of their unit are bazookas. They have machine guns, a lot of them. They've got 50 cal and 30 cal in most of the vehicles. So they can put up a lot of noise and spray lead as they withdraw, but they're not going to stand and fight, particularly against armor. But it worked. So they held on long enough for another division to come in, and then once they got in line, then the Ghost Army just wrapped up and disappeared. That's where they got the name, the Ghost Division, was applied to the 6th Armored Division because, as far as the Germans knew, it went over here. They went from full engagement to not, but they didn't catch on. Okay, next, please. This is one I just love simply because it seems like everybody in the world is tied in with these guys somewhere. And in this case, one of the people that shows up is Major Theodore Geisel. The guy we know is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss showed up because he was with the Army and he wanted to see a quiet place on the line, and they sent him into Luxembourg City. And at one point, he and my dad were together in the same room. So, you know, that was one of my dad's claims to fame. But then he took off one morning with his driver, drove off into this quiet sector as the Germans attacked. So Dr. Seuss spent somewhere between 3 and 5 days totally cut off behind the enemy lines. And when they finally did find him, he had gone all the way back to New York on his own hook, which again, as a major, you're not supposed to do that without orders, but he was pretty upset and sent a blistering letter to the guys at the 12th Army Group headquarters. Okay, next please. Some of the things the guys did, I mean, again, they're running their exercises and whatnot, but as they were pulled back from the bulge, Christmas came up and they decided to do some Christmas stuff, and they made Christmas packages for refugee families that were near where they were. These people were cut off. They had nothing. I mean, yeah, the Germans aren't running them anymore, but what do they have? Who's going to take care of them, et cetera? So the men got together and they made Christmas bundles and included some medicine for the parents of these kids and stuff. And one of the things that the guys talked about, which struck me, this is 1944. The war's been going on hot and heavy since '39. Many of these children had never tasted candy before this. Think about that. Never had candy because their lot in life was pretty miserable. These are drawings. This is one of you see the Hershey bars in the corner. But this is another, this is a little boy done by Victor Dowd. And it was the boy that wouldn't smile. He was just so, overwhelmed, shocked, depressed. Nothing they could do could cheer this little guy up. But he sat there clutching his box of goodies. And they saw a lot of that thing. Sergeant Laubheimer's comment I thought was interesting is soldiers being soldiers. They got together and sang Christmas carols. Half of them were Jewish. Man, the carols were probably just fine. And everybody had a good time. Okay, the next operation is now several months down. They've done a bunch of other operations as well. This is Operation Viersen. Operation Viersen is important because it is a deception operation to become targets. They really, really want the German army to line up against them because what's going to happen is this. There are two divisions coming in and they have to cross the Rhine River, the last natural barrier to go into mainland Germany. Going to be fiercely contested. So the plan is they'll go so far with the real units, black the real units out, take off their patches, cover over their bumper markings, and they will go up north and they will cross just south of the town of Wesel, part of 21st Army Group, Montgomery's operation. In the meantime, Ghost Army units will feed in. They'll come in, one from Holland and the other coming in from the south, and they will replace them and they will become the 30th Infantry Division and the 79th Infantry Division. And do all the things, sonic, radio, all laid out with a, here we are, we're ready to come attack you, shoot us. Which is pretty gutsy when you think about it. They weren't up against people who were bad shots at all. So they're operating down here, and what ended up happening, and this is why this is really significant, it worked. The German army concentrated its forces against the Ghost Army and had very little up here. So when the 9th U.S. Army, and an army is a big animal, it's multiple divisions, corps, echelon above division, echelon above corps, goes across the Rhine River, they take 36 casualties total to get an entire U.S. Army across the Rhine. Now, life wasn't all good for the Ghost Army. They took some casualties themselves, but what that did is it allowed the entire 9th U.S. Army to go in and carve out a spot. Unfortunately, they went into something called the Ruhr Pocket, which is a lot of debate about the battles in the Ruhr Pocket, but that got them across. We did the numbers one day and said, well, if you had that many men in a big training exercise, like at the National Training Center, where they were actually working around with armored vehicles and whatnot, and they're doing night operations, how would that compare on a per capita? And it turns out that where we were running big exercises at the National Training Center, we had more casualties per unit than the entire 9th Army did against somebody with real bullets. So really hugely successful, and probably the gold star in the crown. Next, please. Here's another aerial. You saw one earlier. Again, you've got your tracks, you've got your stuff lined up. That's all dummy equipment. as part of the deception. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but this is a map of spoof radio. So they are very detail oriented, and they're going in, and as the real units hit a certain physical point, they shut off their radios, and so this is true action up to here, and then at these control points, they shift off into complete fabrication. The real units go dark, and the Ghost Army takes over. And one of the cool things about this, how many of you are familiar with the Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink? Just a few, okay. A key piece of his argument in that book is called the operator's fist, the fact that when somebody is sending Morse code, their sending style is so distinctive, you only have to hear a very little amount of it, and you can say, that's Fred from over there, or that's Roger from there. You aren't supposed to be able to copy that. And you're not supposed to be able to copy it for over a long period. You know, it's supposed to give it away. These guys, and a lot of them, the Morse code guys, were musicians. They would sit next to the real person with a dummy key and just, you know, kind of work their pattern. And then the real guy would leave, and the dummy guy would just flip the switch and turn on. And so they routinely mimicked the telegraph operator's fist of the real people, which again, even until the time Malcolm Gladwell was writing his book, which wasn't all that long ago, it was supposedly impossible. I haven't written to him about that, but I suspect he's figured it out. This is just a list of, you know, minute by minute, 3 minutes, 10 minutes later, each of these different stations is now starting to broadcast fake information. But it's all scripted. They're not sitting there making it up. It's all structured so that it's, again, detailing on radio unit movement. Who's going where, how long they're going. And also it includes things like, we can't get hold of these guys over here. You know, please pass on a note that so-and-so, his promotion came through. So it's a little of that as well. Okay. These are an example of the real versus fake insignia. The one on the left is the 79th Infantry Division patch that my dad wore during the operation. The one on the right is the real one. Two guys named Seymour Nussenbaum and Bernie Bluestine made the patch on the left. I'll give you a little intro to them in a minute. The last operation that they did was not a deception operation. The deception's Operation Viersen across the Rhine, that was their last big deception. So you've got these people hanging around. What do you do? Well, the problem came up with, they started liberating slave labor camps and concentration camps, and they had lots of people that needed help. They also needed to be kept out of harm's way. Who do you have to take care of those people? Which troops do you use? There are no trained units for doing that in the United States Army at that time. So they reached out and they went to the Ghost Army, which had a couple of advantages. One, they didn't have any other mission. Two, they were very creative. Three, many of them were first-generation Americans who spoke another language. Collectively, they spoke all 29 languages that the people that were being liberated spoke. They ended up breaking it into 5 camps. This is a unit of 1,080 men on the TO&E, and it wasn't full up with that 1,080, having to take, or not having to, but taking care of 100,000 camp inmates who have just been released. There's a typhus epidemic, everybody's malnourished, and an odd thing happens, which we've seen in Iraq and we've seen in Afghanistan, which is when you take the overlying thing off, people go out to start settling scores. And so one of the problems they ran into was the Poles and the Russians were at each other's throats. The Czechs had some issues with some other folks, et cetera. So they had to get in there and they had to take care of these people. And some of the only people that some of these soldiers shot were shot during this period. They were shooting Russian deserters who were preying on the newly released camp inmates and also the civilians in the area. The U.S. Army said, never happened. And the Brits finally let it out, and finally, when the Soviet Union broke up, the Soviets let the word out that, oh yeah, we had that problem. But we had to be very quiet about it because the Russians were holding thousands of American prisoners of war because they were coming in from the east, liberating American POW camps. And they weren't giving our guys back to us. And so there was a lot of back and forth. And this is a very strange, kind of dark part of American history that isn't in the books. This whole liberation period, because it's a wrap of all these refugees, displaced persons on the civilian side, and also prisoners of war, English, American, and Canadian, and the Russians, and how that all sorts out. And if you're a Russian, you don't want to go back. And unfortunately, we forced many to go back, and it didn't go well. All right, now let's talk about these guys in another context. These are, now I'm going to start focusing on some of the Jewish soldiers within the units. These are two sketches done by Arthur Shilstone. You may well have seen Shilstone's work before, because he was an illustrator in Smithsonian Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and a number of other big magazines kind of thing. But this is Shilstone's rendition. This is Normandy, where it's hot and they're digging in June of '44. And this is Battle of the Bulge, which is one of the coldest winters on record, and they're out there. So there's a tendency, and this is my concern about the Hollywood movie, to make it all light and happy. These guys didn't have a great time. As one guy said, I'm waiting for the day when I don't have rain in my pockets. Because they lived out until late September in Operation Bettembourg, they lived outside in the field. Little pup tents, and they'd have about a 3-foot by 2-foot patch of dry ground, and that was it. So it was not an easy life. It was hard there just in terms of regular life as other. Next, please. One of the questions that came up was, and this really what started this whole visit here. One of the guys made mention of, we had a lot of Jewish guys in the unit from the arts, because the 603rd Camouflage Engineers had painters and set designers, and they had model makers, people that were very skilled with light and color and attention to detail. And they drew a lot of them through Pratt Institute in New York City, from northern New Jersey and New York City. They also had a number of them in the signal companies, because the signal companies were where you had high technical skill needs. And probably the funniest comment that one guy made was, yeah, while the Irish kids were beating each other up out on the street, we were in the radio club, because you could make money being a Morse code, being a Morse sender. But here's a problem, is the Army didn't keep standard records for all the enlisted personnel, only the officers. The other thing is they didn't break it out by a religion. You had it on your dog tag and you had it on your record jacket. But as far as current records that you can get now, very, very difficult to sort out. And here's an example. Okay, there's Irv Stempel. We know from talking to Irv, and you saw Irv Stempel in that first clip, that yes, he's Jewish. How about Ben Schwartz next to him? Is he? Or Stan Kaufman? Is he? We don't know. We've come around to figuring out in a few ways by talking to other guys who are still alive from the unit, and also obituaries. So if you come out and say this person was a member of congregation, blah, 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 okay, we'll check that box for them. But Ben Schwartz from New York, it's going to be a while. There are a lot of Schwartzes. Okay, next please. This is Mickey McCain, an artist. Mickey was a great guy. People thought well of him. He was a master sergeant in the 603rd. Used to be Irving Nussenbaum. This is another problem we ran into, is people change their names. And sometimes they change their names more than once. He went on to become an artist. He went back to art school after the war and became fairly well known. The best man at his wedding was a guy you probably never heard of named Bill Blass. Blass was part of the 603rd. He was in my dad's platoon, actually. And Mickey asked Bill Blass to be his best man when he got married after the war. When Bill Blass sold the company that bears his name, it was doing $700 million a year. At that point, Bill Blass was 19 years old and just, you know, another smart young kid. Next, please. This is Ned Harris. Ned Harris is Jewish. Would you go from the name? Oh. But yes, it turns out we know because of another thing. Ned was a very good artist. You saw him in that video clip at first. And that's one of the ones that he did of a bridge near Luxembourg that has been bombed out. Probably 10 guys did that painting in their own way. It was so catching for them. Next, please. This is Seymour Nussenbaum. Seymour is still alive. He lives in Monroe Township, New Jersey. And there you see him on the left in 1943. There you see him on the right in 2018. One of the cool things is he kept the most amazing scrapbook. He kept everything. He has documents we had never seen before. We didn't even know the Army produced them. One of the things, I'm one of the board members for the Ghost Army Legacy Project. The problem in part is his notebook is starting to break down. Wartime paper was high acid, nobody expected it to last long, and it kind of crumbles. Every page he'd turn, he'd have little snowflakes. We've now stabilized that. It took about $17,000 because these things are huge. And again, he's got stuff we'd never seen. So now it's preserved. He's got things like sections of parachute cloth from the 82nd Airborne's jump into Normandy. He's got all kinds of stuff in there. And again, very meticulous, everything identified, when, where, what. Super. And he is a very fascinating individual. You assume that somebody who's 94 years old, when you go visit them, it won't take long because they're going to get tired, right? What do you think, Marty? Does he get tired? We got tired before he did. Every time. Next, please. This is Hal Laynor, another one of the Jewish soldiers. His story is a little different. Again, that's not his original name. He was wounded, and he went back to Paris to recover. And while he's recovering, the fellow comes through, he's an older fellow, chatting with the soldiers. And Hal says, yeah, I'm an artist. And this guy says, oh, really cool, I'm an artist too. Here's my address, why don't you come visit me? So Hal was well enough to get out of the hospital, but he still needed to recuperate. So he went to this address and looked the guy up. And the guy is Pablo Picasso. So Laynor he stretched his recuperation out somewhat. But he got to work with Picasso in Picasso's studio. And this is one of his things. This is called Dog Tired. And you can start to see the surrealist painting motifs coming in. Some of Hal's stuff right now, I just checked this morning, is for sale on Etsy.com. He did a wide variety of stuff, and some of it is really amazing. But you can see if you look at it over time, yeah, there's a museum that's got his stuff as well. Over time, you see how it evolved, and you can kind of see the pre-Picasso, post-Picasso, and some of the post-Picasso stuff is really wild. This is Irving Meyer. Meyer was with the 406th Engineers, which are combat engineers. They were trained alongside the airborne, minus the parachute jumping. They were the toughest guys in the unit, and they provided security, and when they needed real combat troops for part of a deception or for security, they used the 406, the engineers. Normally you don't look for engineers, you look for infantry for that. These guys were very, very highly trained. Well, he went back to Pratt Institute, and where the other guys had studied art, he studied engineering. Irving Meyer is the father of that particular peculiar piece of hardware. Anybody know what that is? Davy Crockett. And why is that significant, sir? That is the first tactical nuclear round that the infantry had. Irving is one of the three guys who led the team that created the Davy Crockett. And he was awarded a special commendation presented to him by John Kennedy when Kennedy was president. It was not popular with the troops, but we deployed them into Germany, and you know, it was pretty serious. We can put those on a Jeep, and we can run them out, and we can bombard you with tactical nuclear weapons. There's one downside to them, which is the blast area is larger than the flight time of the rocket part, which means that it will come back and get you. So you had to dig a deep slit trench, push the firing button, then jump in the trench and cover yourself over while the thing went bang. But we fielded it for a while, and the 82nd Airborne had them. And I'm not sure who else had them, but I know the 82nd did.
Division in Europe, one of the first Potomac divisions.
I'm sorry?
One of the first Potomac divisions that was assigned to Germany.
Oh, the first Pentomic divisions, yeah. That was one of my ahas. This was, I was doing the research for this, is like, you know, I've dealt with Irv's son, Rob, who's a lawyer in Chicago, but didn't have that part of it. Arthur Singer. Odds are you've seen Arthur Singer's work. He did Birds of America. He did a number of other things, and that is his postage stamp series, which is one of, if not the most popularly collected set of postage stamps. That's one of his self-portraits. He did several. He did that one in 1944 while he was in the field. His son helped us out with the historic marker for the Operation Bettembourg that we just placed in Luxembourg in September. His son Alan designed it for us. Gil Seltzer is 104 years old in West Orange, New Jersey. He is an architect, and he is still working. You saw him in that earlier film clip, the guy that said, "You mean you want people to shoot? We want people to shoot at us?" And the answer was yes. We decided it was a suicide unit. That's Gil. Bernie Bluestine, not in that video, but there he is at our historic plaque being dedicated, and he was one of the guys making fake patches in the factory section. He's alive and well and in Chicago. This is a list of Jewish soldiers in the 23rd that one of the surviving veterans could remember by name. And that's why it's not quite organized. But his first person that he met was Isidore Moskowitz. The guy that gave us the list is from rural Ohio. He went into the Army when he was 17, so he was 18 when all this is going on. And he had never met anybody Jewish. But he met Moskowitz, and they hit it off. Moskowitz was a bit older. They became friends. And from there, Moskowitz introduced him to all these other guys. He did have one observation. He said, "For a long time, I believed that all of Brooklyn was Jewish, because everybody I met was from Brooklyn." These were from the 23rd Signal Company, the technical specialists, the guys that were good with Morse, the guys that were good with radios and electronics. So you get a bit of a sense, and this was by no means, this is simply one guy's list of friends. So a lot more than that out there. Thank you. This is another list. When we talked to Seymour Nussenbaum, and this is a bit of how I guess my interest got more piqued. I had asked him if when he was in Europe if he had attended any of the services that Rabbi Max Eichhorn, who was the chaplain, had put on, where guys from other units could come in. And he kind of, at the time, he went, nah, it doesn't strike a bell, you know, whatever. Next time we went to visit him, he said, I have something to show you. Aha, I have remembered. He had pictures done by the Signal Corps of the Rosh Hashanah services in 1944 that were done in Verdun. And they took over the Verdun synagogue, which had been desecrated and trashed by the Nazis. And he got, the rabbi got 10 prisoners of war. And he spoke German and got these guys in there and said, you're going to clean this up. You guys made this mess, you're going to clean it up. And they did. And so they had services at Verdun and for guys from all the units around. Well, it turns out that one of the units was the Ghost Army. So this is a list from Seymour Nussenbaum, who was one of the fellows that went, of some of the guys that went with him in his truck to the Rosh Hashanah service in 1944 in Verdun. That synagogue went kind of unloved for a number of years. It is now back in operation, so you can go see it. Helmut Eisenberg there on the bottom, interesting, he was in the Boy Scouts with the Crown Prince of Luxembourg. So when they got into Luxembourg, a couple of funny things, one of which is Luxembourgish is very akin to Yiddish and they're mutually intelligible. So all the Yiddish speakers could speak to the Luxembourgers. They became fast buddies. The other thing is they needed some German uniforms and equipment, and Helmut said, no problem, I'll go talk to my buddy the Prince. They got everything they needed. And I did not have the picture, I wish I will try and get it, of Seymour Nussenbaum as a German SS officer. And it's hysterically funny because, you know, your first thought is one of the evil empire, and then you realize that it's Seymour putting people on. Which, he didn't do it here, he did it there as part of something else they were doing. These are some of the guys. There's Arthur Shilstone there on the left, Seymour next to him. All the way on the left is John Jarvie, who was a member of our board, who has since passed away. And Nick Leo on the far right. Nick isn't one of the Jewish soldiers, but he's interesting in that he went into Omaha Beach the night of D-Day, and they were going to run a radio deception, and turned out that the 82nd Airborne lost a lot of its radio gear in the jump into Normandy. And so instead of being a deception, for about 2 weeks, they were the radio voice of the 82nd Airborne. So Nick is still with us. It kind of speaks for itself. That was a classified document. When I found out about it through guys in the Interagency Deception Committee, and I got hold of Mr. Kronman, we had a nice chat on the phone for probably a good half hour until suddenly it hit him, which was, who are you and how do you know me? Because he didn't know, somebody had tasked him to do a history of the 23rd Special Troops. That was 1982. Nobody had declassified it yet, so the wires got crossed. So he's working on this. He said he was hauled in and interrogated under sharp lighting and the whole bit. He said he was terrified. And it took a while to kind of calm him down, but worked out. This is our Ghost Army Legacy Project.org. There's information about the bills we're trying to get for visibility for these veterans. Also, the preservation, the archiving of stuff that these guys are giving us. We have 3,500 artifacts last time I checked. And most of the money is going for education and preserving stuff. Turns out that archiving is not a cheap business. So please take a look at the website, and if you feel so inclined, we would be happy to take your money. And with that, I've talked, you talk. Questions?